To the first public meeting of the New Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. This morning we're going to hear about the work of the BBC World Service. The World Service is funded mainly by the BBC licence fee with some additional funds from the FCDO, and we want to find out if there is a more sustainable way of funding the World Service in the future. We're carrying out this work in parallel with our friends in the Foreign Affairs Committee, and of course we should acknowledge that this work builds on an inquiry which was actually started by the International Development Committee in the last Parliament. So for our first panel today, we're joined by Fiona, who is the Joint Controller of the World Service Languages and Deputy Global Director for BBC News, and by John Zilkha, who is the Controller of World Service English at the BBC World Service. You're both very welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, before we begin, I should note that the committee was hosted by the BBC at New Broadcasting House last week, and I have to ask, do any other members have any interest to declare? Tom?
Chair of the BBC APPG.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Yes, Paul?
Former presenter of BBC Radio 4's Week in Westminster and a graduate of Cardiff Centre for Journalism Studies.
Very good. Rupert?
Lowly employee at the BBC in the 1990s.
Thank you very much. Very good. In which case we'll oh, sorry.
A member of the BBC APPG.
Thank you very much. Excellent. In which case we'll now crack on. This is to both of you, but John, I'm looking at you, so I'm going to start with you. Many people who pay the BBC licence fee will associate the World Service with radio broadcasts, but what actually, in real life, does the World Service look like in 2024?
So, World Service is a major contributor to the BBC News' overall reach globally. BBC News reaches 414 million people a week around the world, and the World Service delivers 320 million of those. The network that I'm responsible for, World Service English, delivers 84 million listeners weekly around the world. I think the World Service makes a major contribution to the fact that BBC News is the most trusted international news provider, that our own research shows us that where people globally consume the BBC, 62% of them think more positively about the United Kingdom. So there are a variety of ways you can look at our role. One is in terms of the influence we bring to bear, the values we seek to share around the world in terms of impartial information, independent journalism, freedom of speech, democratic participation. But also we also reach a very large number of people as well.
And the most popular way for your audiences to access the World Service, is it via TV, is it via radio, or is it clicking on a website?
Well, for different services, it's going to be a different answer. In terms of the English service, it's a variety of ways. Around half the audience comes to us through direct relays, which is what FM, DAB, that sort of thing. But when you take in syndicated audio online and things like that, so that's through partner stations, third-party distribution arrangements, licensing, then naturally the majority of the audience is through third parties. So it's a very complex ecosystem. We're reliant on partner stations and partner broadcasters, partner platforms around the world, but also direct reach through relays and that sort of thing is another part of it. But for Fiona, there'll be different answers to that as well.
In that case, Fiona, same question to you, please.
So for the language services, it depends on the market and it depends on how we're able to reach those people. So for example, we have two TV channels, Arabic and Persian. We have radio services where radio remains dominant, so Hausa and French in Africa. The Burmese service has a radio station, and for Afghanistan, radio remains really important. So we retain radio where we need to be. But 124 million people access the World Service through digital. So every service has a site, but also social media is a very important part of that offer, both to bring people directly to our sites and also because that is how people are accessing the news.
Does the World Service in 2024 look different from the way people might imagine it?
I think so, because I think sometimes people imagine it's radio primarily, but I guess some of the examples I've just shown shows the diversification. We need to serve audiences where they are. We need to do that in the right timing. Different markets have the digital tilt at different times, depending on data costs, for example, who has access to that technology. So while we change and adapt, we're trying to get that speed right for different markets, and that's particularly important for audiences of extreme need. I've mentioned Afghanistan, but other parts of the Arab world where people really need us to remain on linear, we are there in force.
What's the focus? I guess if you're thinking about the UK, the World Service might be associated with news, but also things like Test Match Special. But in the foreign language service, what's the focus? Is it news and current affairs or other things as well?
It is news, but also health is a very important offer for us, information kind of more generally. You've mentioned sport, and our African services particularly are very interested in that. But what we're looking to do is that the core BBC mission, helping people understand the world around them in order to discuss things, in order to kind of take inspiration from other parts of the world, coming up with perhaps solutions for climate change. It's to kind of join the dots really to help people see the world around them.
Is there anything that people might learn about the BBC World Service that would most surprise them?
I think hopefully the sheer diversity of what we do. I can give you an example of Afghanistan, where in the last 2 years we've launched DAS, which is an education programme for the girls, particularly of Afghanistan, banned from school. So we were able to use Bite Size from the UK, which is a brilliant educational resource for British children, and adapt that for Afghan children. So I think the kind of exciting and inspirational parts of the World Service, I hope, would be of real interest to people.
I think we'll probably... Yeah, sorry, carry on, John.
I think also the breadth of the overall offer is what would surprise them. It's not just about news. I mean, there are, as Fiona's mentioned, the health and useful information, but there's also some quite active stuff around arts and understanding what's going on in terms of different parts of the world, in terms of their creative and cultural communities. So it isn't just about geopolitics, is what I would say.
Very good. Thank you very much. Zoe.
Thank you. So really great to see you this morning. Thank you so much for being here. And I understand that the audience of the World Service is about 320 million per week. Is that correct? Correct. Fabulous. And is that for both the English service and the foreign language service combined?
That's right. So English is 84, and the rest is languages.
Yeah, okay. And I also understand that you have specific targets for reaching women and young people. Obviously, those are two groups who it's particularly important we ensure have access to quality news and information. And you also mentioned the fact that actually it's enabling young women to be able to access education. How are you working to achieve those targets? Can you give us a bigger picture overview?
I can. So we have targets for both young people and women. At the moment, we're reaching 25, and this is across everywhere for the World Service. We're reaching 25%, and our target is 29. So there's lots of ways we are approaching that, from the tone and approach of what we do, every bit of journalism, every story that we do, how that can be really accessible to the most amount of people, but also the platforms that we're on. Obviously, young people use different platforms and a mix of platforms depending on the market. For women, we reach overall 34%. Our target is 37%, but we have increased that. We're 1% up on last year. I think reaching women and girls is a key strategic objective for us. And I think that 37% shows that there are other structural obstacles for women to access the BBC and access news. Technology, devices they might not have access to. There's lots of other kind of things to take into account. But again, the way that we approach that is by having a mixture of our platform strategy. Where are we? Where are women? Where are young people? What does it look like for time-poor people who might have less time to spend? So they might not read in-depth pieces, but they might be able to access a really good explanatory bit of video. We also have some female-centric content, which I think is very important. 100 Women was part of a scheme to do that, and that remains very popular. But we hope that drives people to us, and then they see the offer, the overall news and current affairs offer that we have. So that's some of the ways we tackle that.
We share the same targets, and we have similar challenges. I think the specific factors for us are when, let's say, a lot of your audiences come through third parties, you inherit the audience profile of the third party. So you've got to try and find ways, therefore, of making your content appeal beyond, just the audiences you're already reaching. What that means in practice is that where we look at new platforms, we have seen enormous growth in the last 6 months, for example, amongst women listeners on Instagram and on YouTube, which is we've made an investment in YouTube. That's because we see opportunity to reach audiences that we're not currently reaching otherwise. Similarly, in different markets, the numbers are different. For example, in the UK, the World Service English Network reaches 47% of women audiences. So I think in that sense, it's just a question of which market you're looking at.
And in terms of the overseas market, do you have a sense of, are there particular countries where, I'm thinking particularly about women, where they are accessing? So are there any countries where there's a real gap where you're not managing to connect with women and perhaps need to improve?
We have individual language service targets for women, and they range. So we have an excellent audiences department that look at a range of landscape factors. Well, how many women are other broadcasters and other media players reaching in that market? And we always have a stretch target. We always want to go beyond that. So some of our Indian languages markets are quite low in terms of the proportion of women that we reach. And so we then put in particular kind of interventions, thinking about a different platform mix, thinking about particular products. So we're trying to be specific for each market. And some of those are, Afghanistan is another kind of key example where we have to look behind what the reason might be that those proportions are lower than we would hope.
Yeah, and one hopefully quick final question. In terms of accessing the World Service, do you have a sense of how many of those are UK and therefore are likely to be licence fee payers?
Well, World Service English reaches 2 million people a week in the UK. That's probably about 2% of the overall audience. I think our public purpose states clearly that our primary purpose is to reach audiences globally. It's a benefit to us that we reach audiences in the UK. A lot of content is shared between us and other parts of the BBC that also then goes out in that way. So it's actually a growing audience in the UK as well.
Thank you. Do you want me to tell you a little bit just about the vernacular, just so you've got the full picture, which is 850,000 people access the vernacular, the language services directly. But I would say that some of the best journalism of the language services you would hear on the Today programme and you would see on the 10 o'clock news. So for example, our Sudan coverage, it was an Arabic correspondent for us, Kalani, who was the first to get to Khartoum, the front line of Khartoum, to see the devastation that's happening there. And without that, perhaps we wouldn't have been able to see it. So I think we see a wider range of the journalism of the World Service on domestic channels.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Zoe, Natasha.
Hello, thank you for coming in today. So I'm just thinking a bit more about sort of the thing you mentioned earlier, John, about trust and the BBC leading the way globally on that. I'd just be kind of interested to know, how is the BBC building that trust with such different audiences? It's quite a diverse range of voices that you're bringing forward. So how do you build trust amongst such varied audiences to maintain that kind of world leader status?
Trust, I think, is the most important thing we have. As I said, we are the most trusted international broadcaster. The Reuters report, which is an annual report, showed actually that our levels of trust have gone up both last year to this year and 2 years ago to last year to this year. So there's a very good trend there for us. How we do it, I think that's a variety of things. We have global scale. So to the point that Fiona made earlier around joining the dots, I think actually the figure is that we're in 73 cities in 59 countries around the world. World Service figure is actually 58 cities in 44 countries, because there are other parts of the BBC and BBC News that have other bureaux as well. So that global scale allows us to really be on the ground. Presence on the ground, I think, is the critical factor in terms of determining whether you have authenticity and credibility. Beyond that, I think within our Trust is Earned campaign that we're doing to sort of really emphasise the point about trust, it's the point about transparency. If we can show our audiences how we know what we know and how we know what we don't know and why we don't know it, then that helps build trust. I think it's something we've made a real push on. I'm sure you're all familiar with BBC Verify as the brand and indeed the unit that now leads the work on all of that, which has really brought together a variety of different teams that were doing similar work, and they've been brought together into one team with a very, very clearly defined brand presence online, a brand presence on television. You hear it on the output that I'm responsible for all the time. Fiona's worked very closely with them as well. Our BBC monitoring colleagues, who obviously monitor media around the world, they are part of that same team. So in that sense, we've really tried to pull together all of those different parts of BBC News that is responsible for verification and finding out what is going on, and then showing people how we do it as best we can. And I think that is the clearest way to maintaining and hopefully building trust.
have any to add?
I think the editorial kind of principles that we all share are crucial. So obviously the World Service has a large body of staff across the world, and the fundamental principles of accuracy, bringing all perspectives into our coverage, the analysis, and that transparency point, which I think audiences increasingly expect us to do. Perhaps a few years ago it was different. We have really had a push on that, and I think we see some of the trust metrics shown by doing so.
Because it's going to become more and more of a crowded, competitive landscape, isn't it, as time goes on? So what are you hoping will be the thing that sets the BBC apart from your competitors as we go forward?
I think a lot of our competitors in these markets are increasingly polarised because they're not able to be independent in the way that the BBC, because it is funded and because of our heritage, can be. So I think it is our adherence to our principles of accuracy, impartiality, transparency that we hold steady in that. The amount of disinformation and misinformation that swirls, people look to us. So we see this a lot in languages where we may not be the place people come first for their news, but they will come to check that the story is correct by coming to the BBC, and we can see that in the kind of analytics we have. So I think that gives us a really good indication of the point of the BBC being in these markets.
Thank you, Natasha. Rita?
Yeah, thanks. Some of these things you've talked about, it's been really interesting about sort of soft power and the polyglot thing, all these different languages. They seem to apply more to the World Service than BBC News, whereas the two kind of merged in 2022. So I just wondered, what is the relationship between the BBC News that we see on TV and the BBC World Service?
I think BBC World Service is an integral part of BBC News. It drives an awful lot of the journalism with exactly the same values and same principles as the rest of BBC. Where they work together is particularly on global journalism. We're able the output facing the United Kingdom is able to draw very heavily upon the journalism that Fiona's teams do. I think perhaps the most notable recent example was the work of BBC Russian, and it's really for Fiona to speak about it, but it was a fantastic piece of work on counting the dead, Russia's war dead, from our BBC Russian service. And it basically, that piece of journalism was then relayed back into Russia to show, if you like, audiences in Russia what the cost of the war in Ukraine was to their citizens. That was a piece of work done by BBC Russian. It ran everywhere on our UK output. It ran prominently on the output I'm responsible for, because we see that journalism, which has the same hallmark and the same value, needs to be shared for our audiences wherever they are.
I would add to that often when there is breaking news, it is a World Service correspondent that's there. So both in the recent examples of Lebanon, where the walkie-talkie attacks and Nasrallah's death, it was BBC Arabic and BBC Persian correspondents who were there. They were bilingual, so you would have heard them on all of our output. I think it works the other way too, so it's very important for our language service audiences to have the brilliant analysis of Anthony Zilkha, who is the online correspondent for Washington. Huge interest in the US presidential elections around the world, and so bringing the analysis of our specialists to the global audience through the language services is a really important part. It should work in both directions.
Yeah, I mean, on Gaza, on Ukraine, there's been good crossover, but sometimes I feel some of your stuff is maybe a bit wasted and it's not making it to the mainstream bulletins when we see Liam Payne as the main story for days and days. Okay, it happened overseas, so maybe that's tangentially a world thing. But, Bangladesh had really big, major things happen this summer. There is BBC Bangla. It seems to be mostly a website. Like, for many years, the majority of my fellow Bangladeshi people, I don't read the language. I'd have liked to see more of that content on mainstream TV. Do you know what I mean? There's a huge diaspora, and it just feels that often these things are a bit of a parallel universe and siloed. So my plea to have more crossover.
Yes, and I understand your plea. I'm going to take it forward. We do a lot of, offering. Bangla is a good example. So Bangla is a website and a digital offer, but we have a weekly TV programme as well. You'll know, of course, that the internet was down, and one of the ways that the World Service needs to have the sustained funding that we're asking for going forward is we had to put in a kind of shadow team because we couldn't publish out of Bangladesh, which is where all of our team are.
Cut off every mobile signal. People couldn't communicate with each other in that country, let alone out here.
Exactly. And the way that we did that, we were able to stay on air, well, in terms of the digital capacity, because we were able to bring a team in, publish from here, publish from a third country. We had to change our operation in order to meet our audiences of need, so that when they were back online, and they were getting back on through various VPNs, and they were doing different strategies to get the news, the BBC was able to be there. But we need that agility and flexibility to do that. We do offer, just on your other point about as much of the World Service kind of content as possible. The news channel is a very a big taker of our content. So we see a lot on that. Obviously, the 10 o'clock news is only 35 minutes, so there's a limit to how many foreign stories they can take. But our offers are always there, and in places of need, the World Service is pushing its content as much as possible for domestic audiences.
And actually, on that particular story, both the audiences for the service itself went up hugely, actually, didn't they?
Yeah.
But also, the World Service English output, which is available in the UK, played it very prominently. And we took a very leading role in making sure that story was front and centre.
I mean, if BBC Bangla, if you could link to Google Translate, so you could click a button and suddenly it comes in English, because I found that intensely frustrating. My cousins used to always say, we listen to the BBC when we want the truth. But do you know what I mean? If it's some of the good stuff you've done is, I think you had a story on African students trapped in Ukraine. When it's crossover, rather than this siloed thing, they can have a website. I mean, in Ethiopia, Uganda, Sudan, NUJ figures say that it's really prohibitively expensive to go on the internet. So people do rely on the old-fashioned wireless and cathode ray. So if everything's going online, it's a bit of a worry.
I'm thinking about Ethiopia there. So our Horn of Africa services remain on radio and digital, because that is how the majority of our audience get on. And some of the most fragile and insecure places in the world, like the Horn of Africa, we would commit to being there, and we reach 7 million a week in that area. And we always have a website, and we are on social media, but it's trying to get that path right in terms of the digital kind of transformation of the market, and making sure our services remain where they need to be.
Can you sort of measure impact factor of these things at all? I mean, do most licence fee payers, they're probably not even aware that there's this whole other world out there. Or could you have a percentage of content that is crossover, or a world news show? I know you're closing down Hard Talk. My constituent Stephen Saka presented it for many years. That's a worry, because that often has these sort of dictator-type figures, or, I don't know, well, they're not all dictators, but international-type figures being interviewed. It would be sad when that goes.
To your first point, I mean, I think we could probably find a way of better reflecting the contribution of World Service language content into UK-facing output. I can do that in terms of the content that we run on World Service English that is also available in the UK, but perhaps a measurement of how much of that is tracked across different platforms and facing the UK audience is an interesting thought. With regard to Hard Talk, I mean, that was a very difficult decision. It probably is a reflection of the wider funding challenges the BBC continues to face through a frozen licence fee for a couple of years. Also, as far as the World Service is concerned, continuing global inflation is a threat for us, and certainly continues to make downward pressure on budgets, if you like. So that's something we have to take account of. But, the Hard Talk decision was a very difficult one. There are other interviews done across the BBC at length that can also, if you like, perform the role of holding people to account, and most of our programmes seek to do that every day. So it's really a question for us for how we organise ourselves in such a way as to make sure that that kind of interview and that kind of offer is still available.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Rupert. James.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. Thank you for coming in this morning. Earlier this year, the BBC said that over 300 World Service journalists are working in exile because media freedom is suppressed in their country. What are the main ways in which inhospitable authorities try to stop the World Service operating?
let's start with the individuals. So you're right, it's actually 325 of our journalists are in exile. The Persian service are subject to extreme harassment, provocation. Some of them have had criminal charges in absentia. We've had death and rape threats that our security services have helped us deal with. We've had to, over the last few years, evacuate journalists and resettle them. So our Russian service are in Latvia. Lots of our Afghan colleagues, including young female journalists on their own, came to the UK and now worked from the BBC from there. So the safety of our journalists is utmost priority for us, and we're concerned about the trends there. In terms of how this reflects in terms of the journalism, a fifth of the language services experience some sort of interference. So in Iran, the satellite signals are blocked for our television stations, television satellites rather. So they have to go in through VPN, they have to go in through a third server to be able to get our information. We have a lot of, there's obviously internet outages in lots of places generally. There's lots of individual pursuit of our services. So internet sites are taken down, social media accounts are blocked. So we have a lot of different interference, and the BBC needs to spend some investment trying to circumvent this, to get around it. It's a bit of a game of cat and mouse. They shut something down, we open something up. So that is an area, again, of increasing concern, and one that we have to respond to in the current landscape.
Increasing concern and additional cost as well, I imagine. Is that a spike? What is 325 compared to 5 years ago?
Yes.
What's the proportion?
So because of the, if you think about Russia, if you think about Afghanistan, the Persian harassment has been going on for some years. So they have been in exile for a long time. Eritrea, Ethiopia, obviously we took our team out of Gaza, and they're now settled in Egypt. One is going to Turkey. So all those examples are in the last few years, and so it's increased hugely. I think it's 70% increase in the last 3 years.
And what are the practicalities of doing that, of being in exile and continuing to maintain the integrity of journalistic content, pursuit of stories? Clearly, it's not just the journalists, but the sources that potentially risk threat and abuse and hostilities. How is that overcome? And do you end up having to try and protect those sources as well as the journalists when you can't have covert physical contact in country, but you're communicating remotely?
I mean, in some ways, unfortunately, we have a lot of experience at this. And reporting a country from a third country requires a lot of creativity and resilience. So we've got journalistic tools. So we've got open source journalism, for example, the kind of forensics that John mentioned earlier on with Verify, thinking about satellite imagery, looking at ways we need to look into that country if we cannot be there on the ground. But we often retain people who are helping us do some of that on the ground work, whether that's contributors or kind of freelancers, people who are working within that. The expertise of the service, because if you are covering, let's take the Persian service in Iran, the expertise of that service are fundamental to the success of BBC News on that story. So when Israel launched the missiles at Iran, I was looking at our notes, and there was 6 members of the Persian service providing for 15 different English programmes across that day. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to cover that story. The expertise that they retain in covering that country of huge importance in our global news output is really key.
Anything to add?
Well, it just sort of enhances Dr. Huck's point actually in a way, which is that story was the day when we lent very heavily into our Persian service colleagues' capability to be able to tell us what the response was going to be. And I think it's just something that happens every single day. We are quite a heavily integrated organisation between the languages and the English network. And that does spread across to the UK-facing output as well. But it's really important for us in terms of representing, if you like, global perspectives on global stories, that we're able to draw upon as much of that expertise as we can.
And as you're having to pay for more of it, and it becomes more expensive, this sort of cat and mouse of infrastructure being closed or blocked and reopened elsewhere, that's coming from the same budget. There's no additional settlement, there's no surcharge or supplement coming from government or elsewhere to cover that?
No, we have had extra investment from the FCDO over the last few years, and we're very, very grateful for that. We try to do our best in terms of the technology challenges. So obviously we're moving to IP. We're not just relying on satellites. So there are other ways we try to mitigate the costs, but in essence they're going up, and we're trying to cover it with the same budgets.
And when we have to withdraw because the costs are too great, other actors move in. And that's what we've seen in parts of Africa, parts of the Middle East, for example. I mean, again, it's output that Fiona is responsible for. But we saw how Russian state media moved in on a frequency in Lebanon not long after we vacated it.
So actually, yeah, I mean, that's pretty serious ceding of territory, of space in moving out, yeah.
It is. I mean, we've spoken publicly about the scale of the investment that for example, Russia and Chinese state media are able to invest. But beyond that, we also know they're very actively courting, other broadcasting opportunities in those parts of the world. So this isn't something that happens once. It's a continual battle. And distribution is expensive, and it's an integral part of how we reach our audiences. Without it, there'd be much point in making the content.
Pretty significant example of the soft power that you wield, right? Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Liz.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning. The Reuters Institute Digital News Report of 2024 said that in many countries they find the news media increasingly challenged by rising mis and disinformation, low trust, attacks by politicians, and an uncertain business environment. How does the World Service approach working in these cases?
I'd recognise that description. I think we've spoken about some of it already in terms of how we seek to maintain and build trust in terms of some of the tools we deploy to do that. I think the sort of combination of rising polarisation, people feeling very entrenched on one side of a discussion or another, and rising disinformation, for whatever reason, are absolutely massive challenges to us. But in some ways, I would just say that makes our work all the more important. It's why we need to carry on doing what we're doing, fully supported with stable funding that we can rely on from one year to the next, to then also address some of these other challenges around the mounting costs of distribution and that sort of thing, the circumvention challenges that Fiona's mentioned. All of those things come together in one piece. So the challenges we face, they're not new ones, but they are rising challenges.
If I can give you an example on the kind of countering disinformation. So in the Nigeria election, when it was clear that that Tinubu, who eventually won, was emerging as the winner, there started being a lot of online rumours that gained a huge amount of traction, that his qualifications had been faked. He had forged documents which gave him a degree and various other things. And this disinformation and misinformation kind of stirred and heightened. And we were looking at quite an unstable, could tip into violence and protests. People were out on the streets, and our Nigerian language services were able to put the resources to do everything they could to try and find and decide whether or not there was any truth at all in these allegations. And a few days after this, they came out with a single, very powerful piece of journalism which said there was no evidence that these had been faked, and they showed all the different ways that they had checked, and the mood just came down, and people on the front pages of the newspapers said that this was the truth, and so the BBC played into that quite heightened misinformation environment, a clear bit of journalism with all of our workings behind it, and that calmed things down. And I think that's just a kind of example of what the BBC can do in those markets where things can get a bit febrile.
So do you think the BBC is winning the information war?
I definitely wouldn't go that far. I mean, it's very big. I think what it does show is the importance of the BBC being in markets and what we can give, what value that brings overall to the world.
It's very difficult to say we're winning when also we're being outspent very heavily by others, and it is a factor. So I think we know the kinds of things our audiences are looking to us for. We know how to try and get that to as much of our audience as we can, but we need the stable funding to make sure we continue to deliver it.
Do you think the World Service is perceived as being independent from the British government, and does it matter?
I think it matters a lot in terms of, because we are a trusted, independent, impartial broadcaster. We're a public service broadcaster. And I think us being seen to be independent of all parties, reporting without fear or favour from all parties, is absolutely essential. For many years, the World Service was funded directly by the UK government, and there was no issue then in terms of perceptions of independence. So I don't see why, as the discussions continue about the future funding model of the World Service and whether that sits entirely with government funding or not, which is very much a matter for the Director General who's spoken about that, I think it wouldn't, if you like, increase concerns around whether we were impartial or independent of the UK government or not.
Yes, good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Liz. Bio.
Welcome. In October, with the closure of the Arabic and Persian sort of services, Tim Davis predicted that there was a loss in sort of viewership or listenership of 40 million people. Did you see that coming? Was it anticipated?
The savings that we made in 2022, which included closing Arabic and Persian radio, so we still have, flourishing TV channels and digital operations in Arabic and Persian, and there were other changes that we made, including programs in Africa, radio for Hindi, radio for Urdu. It was a whole suite of savings that we had to make that totaled 28.5 million, which was a huge amount that we had to find to take out of the business. Not easy to do, and they weren't easy decisions. We did have an estimated audience loss, and it was around 40 million, and that did indeed happen.
In my area, we also had to contribute to that £28.5 million figure, and that involved the closure of 11 titles and a 60% reduction in documentary commissioning. That's a very significant impact in terms of how the offer you're giving the audience at that point. It speaks to the wider point about consistency of longer-term funding. And I think, as we see again, that other organisations spending huge amounts of money in parts of the world where we traditionally have been very strong, what we also see coming through as a result of that investment by them is their trust grows. Where you have presence, you have trust. You build trust. There's a direct correlation between the two. So where we have to recede from somewhere, as we described earlier with the FM frequency in the Middle East, and others step in, that builds trust in those organisations. So we've spoken a little bit about soft power. That isn't a stated goal of the World Service, but in terms of our desire to reach people with independent, impartial information, to promote democratic accountability and democratic governance, I think those sentiments chime very strongly.
Brilliant. Fiona, did you want to come in as well when you answered? Was there anything else you wanted to say?
I just thought you might want a little bit more on the Arabic radio. And if you do, I think we weren't able to, if you think about the timing of it, we were making those choices because of the financial situation. We weren't able to foresee what happened in October in Gaza and in Israel. And so, would we look back on that, and would we have made those choices about Arabic radio? Potentially not. It's difficult to say, but it doesn't feel like a good decision, but one that had to be held because of the funding. We have since then been able to provide emergency lifeline radio operations. We put in a programme called Gaza Today, which comes twice into Gaza, which is news but also information, including how to treat wounds. You know, it's kind of an information program as well as a news program. And we have those kind of dial-up services, we call them, and having the flexibility and the adaptability to do that as the World Service is a really important part of what we do. And when our funding is restrictive or we're spending all we can on our core services, we don't have the ability to do that. And so I hope whatever kind of sustained funding we have in the future, we will be able to do that. I think it's a position of strength we come from in order to do that.
Brilliant. And so it's a stated sort of aim to sort of grow your sort of your listener sort of base. We've lost 40 million listeners. So where have they gone? Where do you think they've gone now?
My concern would be that they would be listening to the FM relays that we have had to give up as part of that. And we know that in Lebanon's case, it was Sputnik who took that FM. So I think it's again that pattern of where the BBC has to retreat, others are waiting to come in, and they benefit from the trusted relationship that we had on that FM frequency. It's a real win for them. In the future, I hope we'll be able to stabilise and strengthen where we are. We've got 42 language services. We want to retain them all. The uplift that has been granted to us, we want to stabilise and move forward. Let's hope we can grow in the future, but the stabilising of it is most important at the moment.
Okay. And I suppose, John, you gave the example of Lebanon. Any other examples where the service has been lost and it's been sort of filled by sort of China or Russia?
Well, I mean, it's actually, to be fair, it's in Fiona's area, but it's where TV partnerships in Africa were given up, then Chinese media came in and paid for that content to be distributed on those same platforms. I think that's right, isn't it?
Yes, in Kenya, Liberia, various others. We see it as a pattern.
You see it as a pattern. Do you, I suppose, can you anticipate that happening?
Well, in the sense that there are now clear precedents of it happening, I suspect were we to step away from any other particular operation, then the same thing would happen. And we know that as I said before, particularly recently, we've seen how Russian state media have been engaging strongly with public broadcasters in sub-Saharan Africa to see what opportunities there are for them there. So I can only assume that they're doing that because they think there's an opportunity there for them to step into quickly. So we have to be very careful to safeguard the operations that we have, the presence that we have, because as I said before, the direct correlation between presence and trust is there for us to see. So if we kind of reduce our presence, then we damage the trust that we're able to have with audiences around the world.
And I think we see areas where state broadcasters are interested. So Sahel, West Africa, Central Asia, in essence places which are already quite fragile and insecure. That is where there is interest and investment. So I think that perhaps shows that picture of where we might go.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks, Bayo. Fiona, can I just double check? From what you said, it sounds like you didn't get any extra FCDO money when you set up those emergency radio stations for Gaza and Sudan. Is that correct?
Yes, both of those we were able to reallocate resources within. And the same for DAS, the Afghan education programme that I mentioned earlier on, although we have managed to secure a bit of philanthropic funding to help us with DAS, because we want to continue to do it, but it's not in the kind of sustained budget going forward.
Philanthropic funding from what?
This bit was from the Malala Foundation. It was only a percentage of what we have to spend to make DAS, but it is a contribution.
And is that something that happens regularly, that getting a philanthropic?
No, it's the first. We do have some philanthropic funding for some products. Our Media Action, BBC Media Action, which isn't funded by the licence fee, primarily works in this space. But the education programme of DAS was slightly different. So it's a new thing that we're forging to see if we can find extra funding to do the things we feel we should.
There's future potential, you think, for that kind of investment from those kind of sources?
I hope so. It was quite it was about, let me think, about a third of the funding of a series. So it was very welcome, but not complete.
It tends to be project-based funding, so it isn't ongoing and therefore sustainable in the medium term. So we ran a series that was supported by Nobel about disinformation. It brought Nobel laureates together with young people around the world to try and take on the work that the laureates had done, because the laureates themselves have been subject to disinformation in terms of the work that they had delivered. It was called Whose Truth, and we ran that earlier this year. But that was a very specific project that we started with them, and it came to an end. So philanthropic is good, but it isn't, if you like, the sustained funding that we need to maintain these operations and to be able to flex in times of needs as well.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Finally, Tom.
Thank you. The government's budget, first budget a few weeks ago, included an unspecified amount of extra FCDO funding for the World Service. Can you tell us about how you managed the uncertainty in the lead up to the budget decision?
There's a lot of scenario planning. It's up to us to think about what we would have to do if funding wasn't forthcoming. It's very welcome funding. It does enable us to maintain all 42 language services, to do some essential upkeep, to also do some of the lifeline services that Fiona has described around Gaza and hopefully Sudan again. So in that sense, we spent a lot of time thinking about what we might have to do if we didn't receive that funding. The pressures on our budgets remain, if I'm honest. Global inflation remains a factor for us. And as we said, there are other competing costs as well. So we're going to have to carefully manage them going forward, but it is very welcome nonetheless, because we can absolutely commit to the services that are there at the moment. We spend an awful lot of time thinking about what we might do in certain scenarios, and the other thing is we're constantly having to respond to unpredictable events, and that also brings with it cost.
I think I would add to that, I hope you may have seen our excellent investigative series called BBC Eye. BBC Eye operates in Africa, in the Middle East, and what we call the rest of the world. And we've managed to do some great documentaries in Indonesia, India, about China. But we don't have enough to cover the rest of the world. And actually, this kind of investigative journalism, this deep forensic, holding power to account, exposing social injustice, really key kind of BBC mission, how we would want to appear to the world, we're not able to do everywhere we want to do. So that uncertainty means some of these documentaries take a long time to produce. The other thing I would mention about uncertainty is that naturally uncertainty is felt by an organisation, and where we exist in very hot media markets, where TRT, where CGTN are looking to take on our journalists, it's hard to hold on to them. So before the Nigeria elections, TRT took 3/4 of our Hausa team. Just before the elections, which is exactly when you need that BBC journalism in a country. So I think there are unseen effects of instability.
Can you say any more about the amount of FCDO funding you received in the budget this year?
And that's for the government to say rather than us.
And if you had a message to send to the government about the importance of future predictability of your funding, how would you summarise that?
I would say that the world has never needed the BBC World Service more than it does now. To go forward, we need to have certainty. We need to be able to operate efficiently and in a stable environment to bring those core missions of accuracy, of a breadth of perspective. Audiences need us, and I think by giving us that stability, we can continue and grow our work.
And if you, this is your final question, so if you've got any other message you want to sort of land with our committee as we sort of go forward on our inquiry?
I think Fiona's expressed it very clearly. It is just about making sure that there is continuity and predictability of support, because that is what enables us to plan. A lot of our work does take careful planning. Projects take time to spin up, and new services or the developments of existing services just take an awful lot of planning. And the greater sense of predictability we have around funding, therefore, is welcome.
When something is lost, presumably it's almost impossible to bring it back. Thank
If it involves particular areas of expertise, then yes.
Thank you very much. You've made your points very powerfully today. Thank you for being our witnesses. I'm going to take a 2-minute pause while we swap over witnesses and bring in our next panel. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for rejoining us, everybody. We're now going to move on to our second panel, and for this we have Richard Sharp, partner at SW7 and former chair of the BBC, and Professor Richard Sambrook, Emeritus Professor at Cardiff University and former director of BBC News and World Service. A very warm welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for your time today. I'm going to kick off with the first question, and I'm going to pose it to Mr. Sharp, please. When you were chair of the BBC, you said publicly that there was a case for central government to fund the World Service. Is that a view that you still hold?
Yes. What I was aware of was the bigger picture in terms of the BBC as a whole, trying to achieve many different objectives, and the impossibility of making a budget fit for purpose for the licence fee payers on the one hand, and to achieve enormous potential global good with a well-funded and appropriately funded world service, and the inevitable sense that central government wasn't aware or wasn't focusing on the consequences of what was the earlier settlement, which required the BBC to absorb a lot of the cost of the world service, at the same time that the BBC itself on the domestic front was facing faces significant competition from other providers of media services. Hence, the issue, which was then one that I was concerned about, is now much more extreme and much more dangerous for the potential viability of the World Service in terms of fulfilling its mandate.
Is there any conceivable way in which the status quo, the BBC funded with top-ups from the FCDO, is a sustainable measure?
I think the appropriate mechanism is to go back to the way it was before, which was to separate the funding for the World Service and to make it fit for purpose. What we're facing now is really a bit like the proverbial frog being boiled to death without a twitch muscle. And the failure of the Foreign Office in particular to observe the consequences of what they're doing as the World Service gets diminished, and as you heard from the previous messages, other negative actors fill the void.
When you were the chair of the BBC, what conversations did you have with government about this?
Well, I spoke to number 11, I spoke to number 10, and I spoke to the Foreign Office. And without success, hence why I went more aggressively publicly on this.
And did you get any sense from any of those quarters? I mean, it sounds like you were making quite a pincer movement on this, attacking from various angles. Did you get any sense that there was sympathy for your position in any of those quarters?
Yes, there was sympathy, but there's a lack of strategic thinking. I think the issue the forced issue for you and for your counterpart dealing with the Foreign Office is what is the goal? What is the strategy? What are the metrics associated with accomplishment? And what are the resources to achieve it? And the nexus that you have is to also be aware of the BBC's obligation to the domestic audience and the consequences from taking away from provision to the licence fee payers media content by diverting that to the World Service. And the consequences for the BBC in its home market as a result of that. How
doable is it? I mean, how possible would it be to change that funding mechanism in the short term? I mean, before the Charter review, for example.
Well, that's the practicality of politics, and as I said, a lack of strategic thinking. A new government has the opportunity to think through these things. And the Foreign Office clearly has to think through what role the World Service plays in achieving our mission in terms of driving British values around the world and the benefits of trust and impartiality in terms of addressing conflicts and making people's lives better. And I think you've already heard evidence to that effect. It's probably a greater opportunity now than ever, greater opportunity for Britain. And we have a brand and a capability to build on, which is the World Service, that we're squandering and is going to be dissipated.
What do you think is the biggest obstacle? I mean, who is standing in the way of delivering that objective? Or what?
Well, I think it goes to the doors that I was hitting when I was the chair, which is first of all the Foreign Office have to understand and believe in it, and not take it for granted that the World Service is always going to be there to succeed, and be aware of the consequences of the lack of funding. I think that ultimately the Treasury has to agree with number 10 that this is potentially a pivotal part of the reach of British soft power around the world to the benefit of the world, not just to the benefit of the UK.
One to Mr. Sambrook. Are you persuaded that the government should take back responsibility for the World Service in full? And if so, why? If not, why not?
I think that ideally, yes, I absolutely agree with what Richard has just said. When they moved to the licence fee in 2010-2014, I'd left the BBC, but from my kind of external viewpoint, I absolutely thought it was strategically unsustainable in the long term because of the pressure it would ultimately bring in terms of trying to reconcile the overall budget between a UK audience and an international audience. And it seemed to me the position that Tim, Davey and Richard has just outlined was inevitable. Therefore, I think it would be far preferable for granting aid to return to fund the World Service in full. I recognise in the current financial climate that may be a difficult ask, and obviously that's going to have to be a strategic decision for the Treasury and Number 10 of the Foreign Office. Are there other options? Well, they are less satisfactory. There may well be other options which will be better than the status quo, but ideally I think it's right the international services, because of the role they play, absolutely should be funded by granting aid.
And Jamie Angus, the former director of the World Service, has suggested a different model, which is for foreign language services, they should be paid for by the government, and the English language services World Service should be paid for by the BBC. Is that a viable model? Can I ask you first, Mr. Sambrook?
That could work. I mean, I think the language service budget would be about 70% of what the licence fee currently covers for the World Service. So there would be something like a 25 to 30% saving in that sense. We shouldn't forget BBC monitoring as well, which I think is, the last figure I saw was about 20 million, would be encapsulated within that as well. But that, as a division, as a dividing line to make, the obvious one to do is in English language services licence fee and the language services and everything associated with them to be funded by granting aid.
And to Mr. Sharp as well, do you see that as a possible alternative?
Well, I think it's a question of where the money comes from, and if it comes from the licence fee payer, then there's a question. What you're getting at is the operational synergy, which is that English language is the lingua franca of the world. And in that sense, clearly there are synergies across BBC capabilities in delivering English language. And I don't think you have to be particularly imaginative to look forward in an AI world over the next decade, where translation capabilities will obviously be embedded in any event as a result of compute power.
And can I ask both of you what you made of Ms. Crack's remark about the closure of Arabic radio? It doesn't feel like a good decision. That's what my old-fashioned shorthand says here. It doesn't feel like a good decision given what's happened in Gaza, is it? And what do you think are the viable alternatives now going forward?
Well, I'm sure they took the decision with the best information they had at the time. But clearly it looks like a bad decision in hindsight. Now, if you look at the Persian language services, the same thing, but at the same time, obviously, if you see the reach and power of the Persian Instagram service, for example, you can understand why it's a prioritization of digital services as the world moves to digital scrutiny of media.
And finally, to both of you, everyone's talked about the need for a secure and stable footing for the future funding. Would that suggest 3 yearly rather than the annual scramble we have at the moment, 3 yearly, 5 yearly funding?
From my viewpoint as a former director responsible for these things, I mean, I would think at least 3 years, 5 years would be preferable. The point being that gives you some certainty for planning. And that's crucial, really, in terms of being able to manage quite complex operations and also being able to flex according to external events that you may have to meet. But certainty of planning makes an enormous difference, and a kind of annual debate is really very difficult to manage.
Mr. Sharp?
Yes, I'd agree with that, but I think that it has to be accompanied by accountability in terms of execution. So I definitely think the BBC should get a longer a sense of planning capability as a result of a longer settlement. But at the same time, it has to be obligated to execute in a way that accomplishes the kind of reach associated with that kind of taxpayer funding.
Thank you.
James.
Yeah, just off the back of that, are there other ways to fund the World Service that might ease the burden of the licence fee?
I'm slightly hesitant to suggest them because I think they're less than ideal, but I think certainly around the English language services, not the vernacular services, there may be some commercial potential in radio, around partner stations and advertising on genres like sport perhaps, or music, cultural areas, not news. But I don't think that's going to be significant income, and I think there are all sorts of potential conflicts of interest that would need to be quite closely managed. But I mean, there will be some opportunities there, but I don't think they're going to be huge.
Are you aware of if that's been considered or been modelled at all in terms of, you talk about it not being a serious income stream?
I'm not aware of anything being done recently. I left the BBC some years ago. I know in my time there it was certainly something that we looked at, and I think there was some commercial activity at the fringes around partner stations, but really nothing very substantial. And I said the kind of potential conflicts and the policy issues around it are quite difficult.
Yes, I think, and unfortunately I entirely agree with what Richard said. And let's not forget that the singular position that the BBC has as an opportunity to present trusted news, free for commercial biases. And the commercial biases don't just come in the obvious sense of how you deal with your advertiser. They come in the nature of the kind of way you want to report news and sensationalize it and make it more extreme to engage with the audience. And the benefit of not being subject to those pressures is that trusted news may be less dramatic, but it's obviously ultimately more important.
Thank you.
Thank you, James. Let's go to Tom.
To Mr. Sharp first, perhaps. What was your response to the budget announcement of additional FCDO funding for the World Service for the next financial year?
Well, look, I think the sentiment is excellent. The devil is in the detail, and I don't know any more than you do in terms of the amount of funding. I suspect it's inadequate. I'd be thrilled to be proved wrong in that sense. And it goes to my hope that there is a clear step back in terms of thinking through what is our strategy for this. Let's not drip feed a little bit as we manage decline, but let's actually take an asset and fund it so it can actually make a significant impact.
And the last government was providing around 104 million a year to support the World Service. Would you see that as a minimum going forward?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's just sticking a finger in the dike, because obviously the bigger picture, which I said right at the outset, is that the BBC itself, in terms of its core capability, is facing a financial black hole in terms of some of the difficulties in its own budget to cater to provide its domestic content.
Yeah, and I agree with all of that. I mean, I think when the budget announcement was made, of course, it was very welcome. But the fact that it was BBC's response was that it would avoid any further closures indicated that it was basically a kind of tactical sticking plaster rather than a more strategic response. And I very much echo Richard's point about what's really needed here is a strategic vision for the value of the World Service and what it can deliver. I mean, there aren't many things that Britain is widely recognised as being the best in the world at, but the provision of high-quality, impartial news and information is one of them. And it seems slightly perverse to allow that to wither on the vine precisely at the time when Russia, China, Iran are pouring significant funds into trying to, in terms, pollute the information environment, when the BBC would be a fantastic tool and probably Britain's greatest tool and brand leader, if you like, in trying to counter some of that.
Thanks, Tom. Natasha.
Thanks for coming. So just to kind of pick up on that point around information and disinformation, Mr. Sharp, in January 2023, in your speech you said there is an opportunity for the BBC to establish itself as the preeminent provider of facts to the world in what is in practice the disinformation age. So what do you think makes the BBC that global gold standard, and what sets it apart from other broadcasters?
I think it has a legacy and a brand associated with trust. That is necessary but not sufficient. What it has to continue to demonstrate day in, day out, that it is adhering to the standards of impartiality. Obviously, domestically, it's subject to independent regulation from Ofcom. I certainly think, in addition to what I said in that speech, I think there is possibly room for the BBC to think through now how it doubles down on its existing reputation by ensuring that its global news is also subject to some measure of independent scrutiny for impartiality to reinforce its own position. The current difficulty it has is that it still marks its own homework in terms of that. And I think externally and globally, that's been seized on by people like the Chinese to criticize the World Service, for example. And I think it's possible to contemplate the BBC, in addition to extra funding, also being subject to, being willing and making itself subject to some form of independent scrutiny, maybe perhaps, for example, answerable to the non-executive chair of the BBC.
Mr. Sambrook, do you have any kind of thoughts around the BBC's position in fighting disinformation and things like that?
Well, I think, as we heard earlier from, particularly from John, I think the actions it's taken around things like BBC Verify and trying to, absolutely strike interventions that counter disinformation precisely have been very good and quite impressive. I think there's more that they could do. I think that absolutely trust is about demonstrating impartiality. Now, these are all quite complicated and vague terms sometimes. I think if you break down what we mean by impartiality, in my view, it's about resting on evidence. It's about clear evidence. It's about diversity of views. It's about transparency and independence. And all those things are things that can be measured and audited, if you like, and reviewed. And therefore, I think both in terms of formal accountability around governance, but also, perhaps more crucially, to the audience can be demonstrated. I think BBC Verify and the work it does it has been good initial steps in that direction, but I think there's further that it can go. But I think that's essential, really, to have audience trust in terms of setting out to counter the growing amounts of disinformation that are out there.
So the challenge would be, and I think I agree in terms of the BBC not marking its own homework. I think that's a very good point, and it kind of allows the BBC to stand on its own 2 feet and maintain that trust and that brand. I suppose the challenge for the BBC, though, is how they allow their competitors to get away with not having the same level of scrutiny. It's a different sort of playing field then, isn't it? They're kind of fighting with one hand behind their back. I wonder if there's some sort of global fight back against disinformation that could be looked at, I suppose.
Well, I think there was a trusted news initiative that the BBC entered into with some other broadcasters. I think that was a very good initiative and a good start. And I know at the time, I think it was tied into some of the kind of campaigns for free speech and free expression. All of that's good. But I think the BBC has to be careful that it isn't seen to take sides, even broadly Western against Southern or Eastern powers. It has to be as neutral and as impartial as it can be if it's going to maintain the trust of audiences in those other countries. So it needs to be careful about how it campaigns. The BBC, is on the side of democracy. I think we could say go that far, but it mustn't become a campaigning organisation. So it needs to step quite carefully.
Thanks, Natasha. Bayo.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Sharp, you used 3 terms earlier. You said brand, opportunity, soft power. Mm-hmm. And I know you've commented on the sort of favourability of the BBC internationally compared to Russian and sort of Chinese broadcasters. So I suppose my question is, what kind of modelling should we put in place to reinforce that position? Or does it happen?
Look, I think it's a very hard question because, and one way to look at it is reach, which is as a result of what the BBC is, what the BBC does, is it connecting and is it communicating? And then there are statistics and there is data for that. And you'll see that on page 43 of the annual report, for example. So reach, I think, is incredibly important. And one of the reasons I mentioned this issue about the opportunity for the BBC to think through how it gets marked, in a sense, and assessed, is the value of some independent scrutiny of the BBC in that sense, being, as I said, potentially reporting to the non-execs at the board, is that that's an external advertisement that it is continuously subject to scrutiny in a way no other broadcaster is, in terms of its impartiality, accuracy and truthfulness.
Mr. Sambrook, is there anything you'd like to add to that sort of question?
In the past, so we're going back over a decade, when my direct experience of the BBC relates to, we had within the World Service independent review panels. I don't know whether they still exist or not. I think they were largely an internal mechanism, but they were for external experts in global affairs, in media, in different regions of the world and so on, who would come together and review World Service output across the piece, including the vernacular services, and give a view to the leadership of the World Service. And that was built into the ongoing reviews and functions and reports back to the Foreign Office. Now, whether that level of review still goes on, I don't know, but I agree in principle that actually having some external voice and external audit, if you like, of the editorial performance is a good practice.
And I should add one thing in response. As was mentioned earlier, Reuters does do a survey of which news platforms are trusted. And right now, it's a very difficult period because we've got the growth of social media and new media in that sense. TikTok, where it is now, as a news source versus 5 years ago, is dramatically different. So it's quite dynamic. But over time, it'll be interesting to see and should be looked at in terms of the polling about whether the BBC is trusted and in which markets it's trusted. And one is capable of instituting such polls to determine the effect of whether there's an effectiveness as a result of the quality of the BBC output.
Okay, brilliant. So in terms of sort of trust, if you like, and reach, do you feel that the service is in danger of being overtaken by Chinese or Russian sort of media? In fact, you even mentioned Iranian as well. So do you think there's a likely sort of threat there?
It's not likely it's happening day by day, to be honest with you. The last budget I saw for Russia's international information services, if I can put it that way, was $1.6 billion a year. I think that was probably last year. I don't know where it currently stands. China is not noted for its financial transparency, but we do know that there was a major investment just over a decade ago of $7 billion in launching more international news services, particularly in the global south. So they are spending very large sums of money in order to try to push in particular narratives favourable to those governments and those countries. Iran, similarly, though I think on a slightly lower scale. And news channels, state-operated and state-directed news channels continue to open every year. And against that, the BBC has the great advantage of its legacy and its brand and its experience, but it's fighting a battle on a less sustainable and predictable financial base, and that makes life very difficult.
You only have to look at the well-reported situation in Nairobi with the BBC cutting its capabilities there, and China putting 500 more people in terms of resources. It's highly visible.
Last question. So what would you say we need to do to mitigate against this?
My view is that World Service funding needs to be sustainable, predictable. I personally think there's a very strong case for increasing it. I wouldn't I? I don't have to make the hard decisions in the Treasury. But it should be granting aid. It is absolutely part of Britain's global soft power. It plays an increasingly important role, and to have it having to play a zero-sum game against the licence fee in UK programming makes no sense at all.
And I think one important point here is, if this year has proved anything, it's soft power is hard power. And therefore, a sense of it being an afterthought for the Foreign Office is a mistake. And we have a massive opportunity to make a difference here, where accurate information will make a difference in terms of what you could call, if you like, the global Overton window, in terms of how policies are implemented within different countries and on the international stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Bayer. But I mean, you say it yourself. I mean, huge sums of money on news media going in from Russia and China. Huge sums of money also in the background on the major infrastructure projects as well that are happening in countries across the world, from China in particular. Aren't we fighting a losing battle?
No, absolutely not. I think there are definitely going to have to be choices to be made. And what I alluded to in the speech I gave when I was chair is that we need to take account of demographics as we do that. And you only have to look at the potential growth in the population of Nigeria to close to 400 million by 2050 to see and pick markets where we need to go. But the reason it's not a losing battle is we start from an incredibly important brand. And it's going to take a long time for the negative actors to achieve the brand strength that we have. We can squander the brand, but the brand in itself is worth a considerable amount of money they'd have to spend very, very hard to even try and approach to replicate in terms of its value. What we are doing is potentially throwing away that brand by not funding it. It doesn't have to be funded to the same extent as these actors, but it needs to be properly funded, and it's not properly funded.
If we go back to pure demographics, and we think about parts of the world which are most vulnerable, which have very young populations, is the BBC brand really as strong as, say, TikTok as a brand?
Well, TikTok is the platform. Conversations I had with Deborah Tonus when I was there which she agreed with and we developed, was to drive BBC product onto the platforms in the right way. So you'll now find that we're one of the biggest, if not the biggest, news deliverer on TikTok. So we've moved from an era of wireless to 10 years ago, 1 billion smartphones, to this year, about 7.5 billion smartphones around the world in a planet of 8 billion people. So the digital platforms are the mechanism. The question is, what is the content? And that is where the BBC can absolutely win, is because trust, impartiality, truthfulness actually matters. There are other associated advantages we may have by being here. For example, the Premier League is a very big brand. So it's culture, sports, the English language, and our values are very powerful combinations, very hard for others to replicate.
Did you have anything to add?
No, I agree with that. I mean, BBC is ahead of the pack at the moment, but it is. I feel it's being slightly undermined from within by the uncertainty around its budget. I do think the BBC has done very well over the last 10 years, which I can say because I wasn't part of it, in adapting to social media and adapting to the new platforms and adapting its content and a new tone of voice and trying to attract new audiences. But this is all moving incredibly fast. It's a very volatile environment, very volatile situation with different platforms emerging every year, content needing to be reformatted and rethought all the time. That's why certainty of funding in order to be able to plan and manage that is very important. If it's living hand to mouth year to year, it's incredibly difficult to be able to adapt to this very volatile environment.
That's right. Liz?
Thank you, Chair. If I can ask this question to Mr. Sharp first. Tim Davie has said that the BBC cannot keep asking UK licence fee payers to invest in the World Service when we face cuts to UK services. Do you agree?
Yes. Look, Tim's looking at real pressure on the home front. The licence fee is paid under a sense of obligation, and the feeling at the BBC is that in order to deliver on that contract to a licence fee payer, they have to deliver content that is valued to the extent that people are paying the licence fee. If that money isn't there, then the BBC can't deliver on that. And then the BBC's own position in its home market is in jeopardy. So Tim has to look at the bigger picture, and he's right to raise the issue for that reason.
Do you agree, Mr. Sambrook?
I do. I mean, Hard Talk was mentioned earlier this morning. You know, Hard Talk was a programme which was actually funded by the licence fee on the news channel, but its principal impact was global on the international TV news channel. So we haven't actually mentioned BBC World News and BBC.com, the commercial aspects of the BBC's international broadcasting, which bring in just over 100 million weekly reach, I think. But, you know, Hard Talk was a very important programme and an excellent programme, but it went under BBC licence fee cuts, but the impact was disproportionately on the BBC's global audience.
Do you think most licence fee payers know that they are paying for the World Service?
No. And I think I would imagine that the majority of UK licence fee payers would not be particularly happy to say we will fund a House of Service over a UK domestic programme that they prefer to watch. They wouldn't understand the logic, I don't think.
Yeah, and the other context to remind ourselves is the licence fee is over a third less in real terms than it was a decade ago. So it's not just a constant licence fee that's being asked to be drawn on for World Service. It's a diminishing licence fee, significantly diminishing in real terms.
Is there a moral responsibility for the government to say this is a national security matter and accept it should be responsible for the funding of the World Service?
I'm thinking about the word moral, which is quite a strong term to use. I mean, I think I would say it's a strategic responsibility that they need to recognise that way.
Would you like to add something?
Well, I'd say, look, what are Britain's aspiration in contributing to world order, constructively and positively, building on our legacy and values and traditions? And the BBC can be central in that.
And if the government won't accept responsibility, should it raise the licence fee instead, specifically to pay for the World Service?
I suppose if nothing else changes, then that is desirable in terms of being able to protect the World Service. But I still think strategically it's unsustainable in the long term. It's
Do you agree?
The wrong form of funding.
I think that would be a mistaken fudge, because I think the value of grant in aid is for proper conversations in terms of not just the amount, but also what the BBC then should be required to deliver in terms of accountability and focus. So I think it would be a mistake, not just in its mechanism, but also the consequences.
Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. So we've already heard from the previous panel, I know you were listening avidly to what they were saying, about the fact that there's been a little bit of philanthropic funding for some of the specific work of the BBC World Service. Do you, Mr. Sharp, see that as a good thing, as a positive thing? Is there potential for more of that kind of philanthropic funding of these really valuable services around the world?
I think in very exceptional and isolated circumstances, yes. But only in that sense.
And Mr. Sambrook?
Not really is the answer. I mean, in my time there was some philanthropic funding through the international charity, which is now BBC Media Action, for educational and health programmes, and I think that's appropriate. I was always very uncomfortable when that funding strayed into editorial journalism and output. That feels very uncomfortable to me, and I think, again, it raises potential conflicts and potential policy issues. I think philanthropic funding for, if you like, educational and health programming or educational courses and so on, I think that can work. Again, it'll only be on a project basis because that's all that these foundations and so on are prepared to fund. But I'm uncomfortable about that straying into editorial output.
If we believe in the BBC World Service and how it has the power to reach out around the world and deliver all the huge benefits you've already articulated, then shouldn't we be open to more imaginative ways of funding it?
Yeah, I think if you believe in it, then you should fund it properly rather than hoping that there will be foundations out there who might pick up the bill somewhere.
Okay.
Thanks, Dame Caroline. And hello, Richard and all Richard panel.
Indeed.
And very different circumstances, Richard Sharp, from when you came in 2023.
Yeah, nice to see you again.
Yeah, and to you. So look, my questions carry on this theme of sort of what the implications for journalism are of these savings, and also the difference between, I think you were both there for that last panel, the World Service that we always think is sort of heroic and moral and polyglot and soft power, compared to BBC News that we kind of take for granted. It's just there spewing out 24 hours a day in the background. So, I mean, look, if the BBC did try and protect the World Service, then where else are these cuts coming from? Where else should BBC News make savings?
Look, I think it's worth saying that the journalism of the BBC is outstanding, and it employs some brilliant journalists around the world. What the BBC also has to adapt to is the opportunities to significantly reduce costs as a result of digitalization. There are ways to do things more efficiently and creatively, and it's very hard for the BBC to execute that, given its history, but it's an imperative. It's had to do that as a result of the budget constraints which I talked about before, and it finds it very hard. I mean, I think you were on the committee with the discussion of some of the cuts, for example, of local radio in Northern Ireland, and that was a small issue. So whenever the BBC makes cuts, it's highly controversial. There clearly will continue to be, as every media company is facing, opportunities to cut administrative costs as a result of efficiencies in technology. But that it just has to do that like any other organisation. But what I would say is the result of the substantial reduction in real terms that the licence fee now represents, that the bulk of the operating efficiencies have already been obtained. And that can't be looked at as a way of producing resources for the World Service now, unfortunately.
I mean, hopefully that will be protected, but can you, Richard Sambrook, identify where these cuts are coming from?
Well, I mean, we know where they've already had to come from under significant pressure. So we refer to cuts in local radio. We've talked about the loss of programmes like Hard Talk. We've seen Newsnight reporting ability being cut back, so it simply becomes a discussion programme late at night. We've seen foreign
into loose women, hasn't it? I mean, it's
well,
it used to
indeed,
be.
but that's a choice that's had
Not
to be
made
because of the budget reductions. We've seen foreign postings close. We've seen a number of very experienced journalists being made redundant. So we don't have to speculate about it. We can see already where those cuts have fallen, and where, if it continues, they will continue to. And I think behind the scenes, we've seen a lot of the sort of individual resources that particular programs and strands have enjoyed being cut back, and a lot of integration behind the scenes, which critics, I think, has actually been managed very well, but I think some critics would worry may lead to a greater homogeneity of output across BBC services. So, I mean, that's what we've already seen going on, and we could expect that to continue, I think, unless there is a better licence fee settlement, or unless the World Service funding is put on a more sustainable basis.
This is the sort of direction we're going to have to expect, suck it up, that things will go in if these cuts...
Where else can news find...
But I think you also need to understand, with all the cuts that have taken place, the BBC is still running at a deficit to some extent. So it's facing serious financial pressure in any event.
As Hard Talk keeps coming up, it's a sort of joint production, I think, between BBC News World Service and it's a podcast, so it's all three. And I know Stephen Sackur has said it's depressing, it's a pillar of the World Service. I think to a lot of people that just seems bizarre.
Well, I mean, the choice, it was licence fee funded, as I understand it. There may have been kind of internal cross-charging for where it was broadcast elsewhere, but it would have been a decision made on, presumably if it's the licence fee, on UK audience reach to some extent. And Hard Talk had a very strong international brand, but wasn't much watched in the UK. So there's a very good example of why, hard choices can impact the World Service disproportionately when it's licence fee funding that's coming into question.
And is that a worry, though, if everything turns lowest common denominator stuff for ratings?
Well, I have no doubt that the BBC News management is trying to manage that as well as they can, but they have been set extremely tough targets, and I think it's inevitable that some much-loved brands and faces will disappear.
Okay, I mean, they're in the room and still hopefully listening. And then also there's a number of journalists who sort of are facing the chop. Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, Sarah Rainsford, John Sudworth. And again, some of those World Service values that we think of these people as very heroic, I think all three of those have sort of been forcibly ejected from countries or had to flee because of the content of their journalism. There is just a worry that, and I'm glad the BBC is still in the room listening, that there are implications for the quality and depth of BBC News for UK and global audiences. I think nowadays it's difficult to divide the two, because everything spreads on all these other platforms you're talking about.
Clearly I'm not privy to the decisions that lay behind those, but hard choices are clearly having to be made, and they won't be being made casually, I can assure you of that.
Okay. Anything different to
No.
the other Richard?
Thanks.
Right, let's hope for a fairer funding settlement.
Thanks, Rupert. So on that basis then, what's the solution, Mr. Sambrook? Just give it more money, or are there other opportunities, solutions to the issue?
Well, I think that the BBC will be has been looking at greater efficiency to the extent that it can, and some of that is through merging operations and greater collaboration and so on as well. I think my perspective would be that it's pretty much come to the end of what can be squeezed out by those means. So I think it is now at the stage where either there is a better licence fee settlement for the BBC, or the cuts are going to become more visible and more painful.
Mr. Sharp, now freed from the shackles of chairing the BBC and with the benefit of hindsight, is there anything that you would have done differently or would be pushing for now if you were still there with this in mind, with this, ongoing financial challenge in mind?
Well, I was certainly disappointed that the last government was unwilling to do what we discussed. So I was unsuccessful in my efforts with a succession of culture secretary and foreign ministers and prime ministers, which was disappointing and obviously was a failure. I think the efficiencies, I had no problems with some of the efficiencies. I think they caused real struggle in the newsroom, and I think within the BBC, in any organisation, change is a threat. But given that it is other people's money, we had a duty to spend it as wisely as possible. And when the result of change taking place and the consumption of media changing, combining news operations so they'd be less siloed, was entirely appropriate. Unfortunately, as Richard said, pretty much reached the end of most efficiencies. There will be more, obviously, and I think AI is a fantastic opportunity to bring some further operating efficiencies too. But the BBC has to be nimble. I mentioned its opportunity on the digital front, which the World Service is obviously embracing, and it's incredibly important to the people who consume it. And I'd point again to, let's say, the Persian Instagram service, Persian language Instagram service for the people who are on. And therefore, I think going with any settlement, there just needs to be very careful strategic thinking about where it should be applied and the accountability that the BBC has on delivering on that mandate. It shouldn't just be receive the money and we'll do what we want to do. It has to be fulfilled with an obligation to the taxpayer with more specificity than we certainly provided when I was there. And I think that's appropriate. And then, as I mentioned, I think there is room for thinking through the benefit the BBC gets from the scrutiny from Ofcom in the domestic market and creating something analogous for the World Service, so that it cannot just continue to be impartial and accurate and trusted, but also has mechanisms that it can point to that reinforce it.
So, taking your point about this is other people's money that the BBC is spending, and considering that effectively, despite all the cost savings that have been made, the BBC is still financially struggling to fund the World Service in the way that you or we would want to see it funded. We're heading towards a charter review. Is it time to look at a different way of funding the BBC?
That will take place, I've no doubt about that.
What would be the solution from your position of having been there at the heart of it and seen under the bonnet?
Well, I'm sure you will obtain a lot of evidence. That's a separate topic to this one specifically, but what I have mentioned in the past is obviously we need to understand that both the regressive nature of the licence fee and there are mechanisms to adjust that. And we need to probably need to look at the universal mandate for the BBC and decide where we want the BBC to go. And then have funding that's fit for purpose. The one thing I felt very comfortable about with the BBC is we have enough now commercial competitors to look at, when you look at the cost of what the BBC delivers, that it is in fact delivering value for money. It is delivering value for money. But I think that in the global stage, where we have the dominance of US players in particular, that there are essential things that go to the fabric of a society where the media and the culture represent. It's not just entertainment. It goes with values, it goes with identity and social cohesion. And therefore you need a successful BBC to do that. And therefore the funding should be appropriate for that, right across the board in terms of the many different functions it fulfills. Localism obviously being an important one, but identity being another, in terms of the different voices within the UK, and that people see themselves represented in a British way, not just in an American way.
And if there is a final message, this is the last question, if there is a final message that you think we should take forward as a committee as we conclude this inquiry, and when we come to question the Secretary of State, what would it be? What would your parting message to us be, Mr. Sambrook?
I would say to look afresh at the strategic asset that the World Service represents, and how in the current environment it can really play a very strong role in projecting British values and in its potential role in an increasingly volatile geopolitical situation, and actually taking a strategic view about it, and therefore finding the right appropriate form of funding for that, rather than a tactical view, which is, in my view, what's happened up to now.
That's interesting. Mr. Sharp?
I'd say that in a globally connected world, culture and media has the opportunity to be distributed effectively globally and make a difference. And the BBC plays an essential part in that, as Britain does, and the World Service is an essential component of delivering that.
That's very clear. Thank you both of you for your time today. It's really clear from what we've heard that from both panels really, that while the budget settlement was a welcome short-term intervention, it's the long-term sustainability and success of the BBC World Service and how incredibly vital it is definitely needs more thought from ministers. And we know that our friends in the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office Committee are meeting to discuss this same topic this afternoon, and their focus is going to be more on how the World Service does contribute to our soft power. And then I expect that our two committees will want to come together in the coming weeks to raise what we found with the leadership of the BBC and to government. So thank you for your contribution today, because it will very much help as we take this conversation forward. Order.